All right, so we're in the fourth chapter of Pirkei Avos, and we'll look at the fourth Mishnah today. The fourth Mishnah is attributed to two rabbis, both of them lesser-known rabbis. In fact, the first rabbi that we're going to learn about is only mentioned in the entire Shas once. This time is the only time his name appears. So the two rabbis of this Mishnah are Rabbi Levitas Ish Yavne, that's the first rabbi, the one who's only ever mentioned in the Shas once, and the other is Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroika, who we see a number of times here and there, and he was a colleague of some of the other great rabbis, Rabbi Eliezer, etc. But what's interesting about Rabbi Levitas is the way he's introduced. Rabbi Levitas Ish Yavne. Okay, so we need a little bit of history, just to understand the context over here. The history is that if you remember, at the time of the siege of Jerusalem, at the time of what led up to the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, so when the Romans besieged Jerusalem, needless to say, obviously it was a siege, so people couldn't get in and people couldn't get out. But there was one individual who succeeded in smuggling himself out of Jerusalem. It's a pretty well-known story, and that was Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. There was a whole story how he managed to smuggle himself out. They pretended for a few days that he was ill, and then they pretended that he had passed away, and they got special dispensation to take him outside of the city limits in order to bury him. Meanwhile, of course, he was alive and well inside the coffin, and he used that as a way to smuggle himself out, and he went face to face with the general who at that time led the campaign against Jerusalem, who was a general called Vespasian. Later, during the course of the story, Vespasian was recalled to Rome, and he became the emperor, he became the Caesar. So in that dialogue between Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and Vespasian, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai recognized that there was no way to stop the attack that was going to happen against Yerushalayim. That was inevitable. It was going to happen. All he wanted to do was to try and mitigate how bad it was going to be. And so one of the proposals that he made to Vespasian was, Ten li Yavne v'chachomeha. Allow me this city called Yavne and the sages of Yavne, because it was a big center of learning. So just spare that city, and that will at least allow us to perpetuate Jewish knowledge. And thanks to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's proposal, Yavne was saved. And thanks to that, we still have Judaism today. So when we talk about somebody coming from Yavne, we're talking about a person who belonged to this great center of Jewish learning. Right? Okay, so that would represent somebody who came from this great center of Jewish learning. Now Rabbi Levitas is called Ish Yavne, the man of Yavne, which is basically a way of saying he was the greatest of all the scholars in Yavne. It's a good question. So I think it's a common surname today, no? Levitas, right? That's how you could spell it. But I'm interested, because you've asked the question, I'm actually interested in how you spell it in Hebrew. That's really interesting. So how do you spell it in Hebrew? So you've got the word Levi. That's obviously the root of his name, the word Levi. Anybody who's going to watch the recording, unfortunately, is going to see this in mirror. Okay? So obviously the word is Levi. Levitas means that there is a tes and a samech pegged to the word Levi. So that's his name, Rabbi Levitas Ish Yavne, implying that he was the greatest person in Yavne at the time. So again, Yavne is a center of great people, and Rabbi Levitas is the greatest of them all. Now that's alluded to in his name, because you've got his name, Levi, and then you've got the tes and the samach that are added on afterwards. What's the gematria, the numerical value of tes and samach? 69, right? 69. So we know that there were 70 sages in the Sanhedrin, or the 70 elders that we speak about. Obviously the Sanhedrin had to be an odd number, so it was actually 71 sages, right? But the concept of 70 sages goes all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu, where we had the 70 Zkenim, the 70 great sages of history. So his name, this is not necessarily his real name. His name is Rabbi Levi, who was called Levitas, to tell us that he was like the equivalent of the other 69 sages. That's how great he was. So he's Ish Yavne, he's the spectacular scholar of Yavne, and he's considered to be the equivalent of the other 69 that would make up the 70 sages. So that tells you he's obviously a great man, which of course begs the question, why then is he only mentioned once in the whole of Shas? Interesting question, and none of the Mefarshim seem to really address that. So what does he have to tell us? So Velevitas Ish Yavne is following on from Ben Azai in the previous Mishnah. So before we can read what he's going to say, let's just recall what Ben Azai told us in the previous Mishnah. In the previous Mishnah, he told us as follows: Al tehi vaz lechol adam. That was Ben Azai's first message in the preceding Mishnah. What's al tehi vaz lechol adam? Means don't disdain any person. Don't disgrace any person. Don't look down on any person. So, now here's an interesting thing, right? We all know very well that one of the worst things that you could do is to speak Lashon Hara. Yes? Agreed? Everybody knows it's a bad thing to speak Lashon Hara. Now here's the question. Is there ever an excuse to speak Lashon Hara? Okay, so what does the To'eles mean? The To'eles means that there is obviously more value in how you're going to protect somebody else or assist somebody else than in the damage that you may do by sharing the Lashon Hara, right? Okay, so in that case we'll understand that it's not really Lashon Hara. It's not really bad because it's L'To'eles. There's some kind of a value that is substantial value enough to excuse you telling this information. Okay, and by the way, that means you have to think a million times if the To'eles is really a To'eles or if I just decided that it's a To'eles. Okay, subject for another conversation. Yeah, that would be an example. Shidduch would be an example. That wouldn't be the only example, right? You're about to hire somebody and they've got a criminal record or whatever it is. Okay, so those would be examples of To'eles. Okay, so are we in agreement that is the only time that it would be acceptable to share something negative about another person? Yes? So outside of the example of To'eles, which mitigates whether it's Lashon Hara, whether it's actually bad, is there ever a time that it is acceptable to speak Lashon Hara? So the therapeutic session would be, the To'eles would be for the value and benefit, the mental health value of the person in the therapy session. And again, you'd have to think a dozen times whether it is really L'To'eles or just a nice excuse. So that doesn't qualify as the full experience of Lashon Hara. My question remains, is there ever a time that it is acceptable to speak Lashon Hara? No, right? We're all in agreement. No. Everybody's in agreement. It is never acceptable to speak Lashon Hara. What about if you're speaking about yourself? Also not, right? Also not. So, al tehi vaz l'chol adam. Don't denigrate any person. Any person. Does that include yourself? Does, right? That's what Isaiah told us. That you may not talk down or look down at any person. Must be including yourself, right? Well, let's see what Rabbi Levitas has to say. So Rabbi Levitas ish Yavne Haya Oimer, that's what he used to say. He used to say, Me'oid, Havei Shfal Ruach. Okay, how do you translate the word Me'oid? Very much, like extreme, right? Me'oid is what? Very, very extreme, like extremely extreme. Yes? So me'oid, havei shfal ruach. You should be extremely, how do you translate shfal ruach? Shfal ruach. How would you translate that? Shfal ruach. Fallen spirit. What do you say? Fallen. Fallen spirit? What is, I wouldn't say fallen, but lowly, yes? A lowly spirit. So you should have an extremely lowly spirit. Okay? And then he explains why. Now, this is also going to sound really strange. Shetikvas. How do you translate the word tikva? Hope. Shetikvas enoish rima. Because the hope of mankind, humankind, is decomposing in the grave. Isn't that nice? This is a motivational speech. Yes? What do we have to look for? What should you hope for in life? Rima. One day, to rot. Okay, so there's something very odd about what Rabbi Levita seems to be saying. First of all, he just told us, Ben Azai just told us in the preceding Mishnah, Al tehivaz l'chol adam, that you shouldn't make anybody feel less than valuable. And surely that includes yourself. So why is he saying over here that you should be shafal ruach? Shafal ruach doesn't just mean humble. Shafal ruach means to have a lowly spirit. And then he says, ma'oid, ma'oid. That's like really extreme. It doesn't say depressed. It does not say depressed. And this is why this will be such an important conversation. And then he says, why shetikvas enosh? Because the hope of humanity is rima. Is to, I don't want to say the word, decompose in the grave. What is this? And by the way, why does he change mid-sentence? Because first he addresses us as individuals. Have is second person. That's how you speak to an individual. You say, have you individually should be in a particular way. And then he says, tekvas enosh. He talks about humanity, which is kind of third person and very general. So are you addressing me as an individual, or are you addressing the crowd? So we need to understand what's going on over here, right? Now, if you had to think of an example of somebody who would be the icon of humility, who would that be? Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Moshe, how do you know? How do you know that Moshe is the ultimate example? Oh, because what does it say? V'ha'ish Moshe anav me'oid. It says that the person, Moshe, was exceedingly humble. How many times does it say me'oid? Once. Yet for us, Rabbi Levita says, me'oid, me'oid. Very, very humble. Well, if ma'oid once was good enough for Moshe, why do we need double ma'oid? Okay, so we have to understand what's going on over here. That's the first part of this Mishnah. The second part of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroika Oimer, Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroika says, Hamechalel Shem Shamayim Baseser. How would you translate the word Hamechalel? To desecrate, right? Hamechalel Shem Shamayim. Any person who desecrates the name of heaven, in other words, Hashem's name, Baseser, in secret, Nifro'in mimenu begoloi. Then Hashem will create a system by which that person will be exposed publicly. So in other words, if a person is not respectful to Hashem, on the quiet, Hashem will come up with a way to expose them that everybody will discover that they were mechalel es Hashem. Okay, you may have a question at this point in your mind, you may. And then he continues to say, Echad shoygeg ve'echad mezid bechilul Hashem. When it comes to chilul Hashem, God forbid to desecrate Hashem's name, echad shoygeg, whether the person did so by accident or unwillingly, unintentionally, ve'echad mezid, or whether they did it dafka, intentionally, it actually technically makes no difference bechilul Hashem when it comes to desecrating Hashem's name. So, any questions on the second piece of the Mishnah? Anything that comes to mind? Any questions? Okay, let's pause from the Mishnah for 1 second. We know as from people, firstly as Jewish people, we are naturally inclined to guilt. So it's really not difficult to get Jewish people to feel guilty about things, right? It's not difficult. So, I mean, we could do it so easily. I think that's why many people don't like to come to shul, because they're afraid that there'll be some kind of guilt that's associated with them. And you walk in. I eventually got to shul. What happens? The rabbi gets up and makes me feel guilty. So, if the Jewish community as a whole is predisposed to guilt, what unique kind of guilt do frum people tend to carry? That's generic. Guilt over children is generic Jewish guilt. What unique Jewish guilt do frum people carry? What? Am I making a chilul Hashem? Right? Why? Because people look at frum Jews and say, oh, look at how they behaved, right? So that's why wherever we go, we're always looking over our shoulder, make sure that the children don't leave a mess, make sure that we don't lose our temper. You always look 4 times before you hoot at the guy who cut you off, just to make sure that he's not going to turn around and say, those Jews, right? So Chilul Hashem is a really big part of our reality. We don't want to desecrate Hashem's name, yes? So, using that logic, that we are super conscious of our behavior, our conduct in front of other people, not only our conduct, the conduct of our children, etc., because we don't want to create a Chilul Hashem. What about Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika's statement seems very strange? What does he say? HaMechalel Shem Shamayim Baseser. A person who desecrates Hashem's name in private. How can you desecrate Hashem's name in private? Isn't the very definition of a Chilul Hashem that it's something which occurs in front of other people, in public? Isn't that exactly what a Chilul Hashem is? The way they're going to look at us. They're not going to say that person, they're going to say that Jewish person, right? So how could you ever have Chilul Hashem in private? Good question, right? Okay. So there are a number of things clearly from this Mishnah that we have to understand. And probably one of the most important is to understand this notion of shval ruach, or the whole humility question. The humility question in Judaism is a really big deal, and that's why this is important, that this Mishnah is juxtaposed with the other Mishnah, al tehivos. You need to know and understand the difference between boz, where you denigrate somebody, and shiflus, which you can only impose on yourself, which is a sense of humility, and maybe even beyond humility, because he says ma'oid, ma'oid. So let's try and understand what's going on over here. In order to understand what's going on over here, let's have a look at what the Rambam writes in Hilchos Deos, which means in the 14 volumes of Mishnah Torah, the second section that the Rambam deals with is how to be a mensch. Isn't that what Pirkei Avos is all about? Right? How to be a mensch? Isn't that what everybody always says? The most important thing in Judaism. It's one of my pet peeves, right? When people say the most important thing is to be a mensch. And I'm like all for that if you could just understand what a mensch is. Right? Mensch doesn't just simply mean somebody who agrees with you or somebody who's nice to you. So when it comes to Hilchos Deos, the laws, the rules around how to be a mensch, the Rambam teaches a golden rule. In fact, it's called, in medieval times, they would call it the golden mean. The golden mean is everything in moderation. That's the golden mean. Everything in moderation. You should not be an extremist. Okay? I hope you're relieved to hear that, right? You're not supposed to be an extremist. Except that if you read what the Rambam says, it's everything in moderation, including moderation. Meaning to say, don't get too carried away with moderation. There's certain things that you do actually have to be extreme about. Right? For example, this is a wacko example. The Rambam doesn't even feel the need to address it, but I'll just use it as an example. There is no moderation when it comes to crime. Be a criminal in moderation. Right? We'll all agree, right? There's no scope for moderation. Only loot shops in moderation. Okay, so that's what you've got to be clear, black and white. Either it's legal or it's illegal. There's nothing to discuss. So moderation has to be taken in moderation. You can't just apply it in some kind of an open-minded, everybody counts for something approach. When it comes to human character, that's what the Rambam's talking about in Hilchos Deos. There he speaks about moderation. So for example, he says, a person who's an extremist when it comes to money, it's incredibly unhealthy. So you get two kinds of extremes. The one extreme is the person who is exceptionally tight, penny pinching. Everything is a cheshbon. I don't know if I can't afford it, or this or that. Usually what people can't afford is other people's stuff. The opposite is the person who has no sense of budget. They just splurge everywhere for everybody. And we like those people, right? Because they're really nice to us. But the Rambam says that's an extreme and you shouldn't follow. There he says moderation. You should know how to manage finances moderately. So don't be too tight and don't be too loose. Be responsible. That's one of the examples that he gives. And he gives various other examples. He talks about, things that again are very positive. For example, love is very positive. So should we all just be loving, especially, let's say, to our children? Just love them absolutely? No, it's got to be balanced, right? There has to be an element of discipline. So there are two areas where the Rambam says moderation doesn't work. One is ka'as. Ka'as is anger, right? There is no room for moderation when it comes to ka'as. That's something the Rambam says you have to expunge completely. Easier said than done, right? The Rambam didn't have load shedding. How did he know about ka'as? Right? Potholes, they're sinkholes now. We've graduated. I heard they opened a new mikveh in Fairmount.
Rabbi, what if you're angry, but you don't blurt out anything, you just keep calm?
Okay, now this is an interesting question. So the question then is the Rambam's recommendation not to feel anger or not to express anger? Okay? Not to feel or not to express anger is a really, really good question. And it might be beyond the scope of this Mishnah, but we'll touch on it briefly. The Gemara tells us, and this is a difficult one, it's a really, really difficult one. But the Gemara tells us, Kol ha-koyes ki'ilu oived avodah zara. If a person gets angry, it is as if they serve avodah zara. So now, what does that mean? Avodah zara, you know what the halacha is about avodah zara? It is the only area of Jewish law that you can transgress in thought. Every other mitzvah, you're only liable if you act. So if a person has an inappropriate thought, but they don't act on that thought, they're not liable. With avodah zara, if a person has or entertains a fleeting thought, you're not liable for. But if a person entertains a thought of avodah zara, that is a transgression. So what is anger compared to dafka? Avodah zara. What does that tell you? That when we talk about extremism, when it comes to not being angry, it means we're supposed to reach a point that we don't even feel the anger, not only that we don't express the anger. Right, okay, now thank God we have something else to feel guilty about. Going back to the original point.
Excuse me, isn't there room for, if you want to discipline a child?
Great, so discipline a child. The Rambam speaks about exactly that. And the Rambam is no negotiation with anger. So the Rambam says that both a parent and a teacher would be entitled to show, this is the word that he uses, to show anger to a child without feeling the anger. Okay, try that at home. There's a lot of work, right? Sorry?
I say for the constructive outcome.
Correct. So in other words, to either, let's say for argument's sake, let's use an extreme example. So a child runs into the street. They have to see that there's a very serious response from the parent. Now, it could be that the parent is more likely frightened than angry, but the child has to realize that that was a serious thing, and they've got to feel the full force. The avoid of the personal work is that we can express what needs to be expressed without necessarily feeling the anger. Okay. Sure.
Just from what I've heard about feelings, is that it's very important not to deny feelings. And it's very
Correct.
important to acknowledge, okay, I'm angry. How you express the anger, you can choose. But if you deny to yourself, I'm angry, it can be very uncomfortable.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to repeat that for the recording. So if a person denies a feeling that they really have, that is going to down the road going to be much worse than acknowledging the feeling, right? So. So that's how you handle the feeling, right? So the question over here is not to deny a feeling. So it's really important for us to understand this. There are two things about what we are supposed to believe as Jewish people. The aspiration and the reality check. The aspiration that we're meant to have is to reach a point where those things don't cause the feeling. That's the aspiration. To have such an even-spirited personality that things that previously would have angered me no longer generate that feeling. That's the aspiration. If I am not there yet, and I now pretend that I don't have that feeling, that's going to be really dangerous. So that's the balance that a person really needs to have in their life, is to understand what I'm working towards and understand where I'm really holding. And if I do actually feel anger, then I have to know how to contextualize that anger and not just pretend it's not there. So honesty, self-honesty, is one of the most challenging and one of the most important elements of being a healthy Jewish person. Okay, this was all introduction, right? What's the other thing that the Rambam says you may not do in moderation? Arrogance. Arrogance cannot occur in moderation. Now that's, one second, that's what the Rambam says. It's not so simple. Not so simple. So he says when it comes to humility, there you should be an extremist. Now, there's a range of humility. There is what's called anova, which is typical humility, and then you get what's described over here, which is shiflus, or shafal ruach, which is an extreme form of humility. We need to understand that continuum. We need to understand that spectrum. In order to understand that spectrum, let's look at what he said. He said, "Because tikvas enosh rima," because the hope of humanity is to disintegrate in the grave. Now, why would that be the word hope, right? That's been bothering us a lot. First of all, you need to know that the word tikva comes from the root kav. Kav means a line. By the way, that's where the word mikveh comes from. What's a mikveh? It's something that has a meniscus of water, right? Which, by the way, is the origin of the word aqua, which comes from the same root, kav, the meniscus. Okay, subject for another conversation. But point is that kav means like the even keel, right? Shetikvas enosh, what keeps people grounded and balanced? Rima, the expectation that you know what's going to happen at the end. Why should I get so excited in the me? Whoa, who do you think you are? You know, that's basically what he's saying. Person's going to walk around strutting their stuff, thinking that there is some kind of a big deal, full of arrogance. Tikvas, what is the even keel? What's going to keep everybody somewhat limited in their arrogance? Rima, the expectation of what's going to happen, so to speak, in the grave. However, a number of the Mefarshim say that's not a good enough explanation, because at the end of the day, generally speaking, in Torah, words are related, and the word kaveh is actually the root, kuf, vav, hey, not just the kuf, vav, and kaveh means to hope. So tikvas enosh, the hope for, for humanity. So what does it mean? Listen to this. This is going to blow your mind. Listen to this. For us, living as we do in this physical human environment of ours, we don't like this conversation. Let's be honest. We don't mind the humility conversation so much. That's okay. We all think we're quite humble. But the disintegrating in the grave conversation, we don't like that so much, right? It's one of those things that makes people very uncomfortable. Yeah? I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you're comfortable with it. But I think most people are uncomfortable with that conversation. Now let's think for a moment, if a person was a tzaddik. Okay, I know what you're thinking. They don't disintegrate. Okay. But let's just say that a person was a tzaddik. Would they be as disturbed as us about the loss of the physical body in the grave? No. Why not? Because that's not their thing. Right? That's not their thing. The tzaddik is floating around on this earth doing all kinds of lofty spiritual things. They happen to be in a body while it happens. But they're not that attached to the body. And we can see this in the way that tzaddik behaves. You know, we have all these stories of tzaddikim, eating food and not even realizing if it had flavor or it didn't have flavor. Things we couldn't necessarily relate to unless someone had COVID. But, for us, we're very invested in the physical form. It's very real for us. So the thought of losing it is scary, and we don't know if maybe there's pain associated with it, etc. Now, according to Kabbalah, the body and the soul, because they spend so much time together, they become enmeshed. And the reason that the body has to decompose is to allow the neshama the freedom to elevate in Gan Eden fully. Because the human being, 99% of the time, while living in this world, enjoyed and invested in the physical reality, so that became part of their soul's reality too. And in order for the neshama to be able to move properly in Gan Eden, it's got to leave that all behind. In simple terms, when you arrive in Gan Eden, what do you think happens when you arrive? Have you ever thought about this? What happens when you arrive in Gan Eden? They have like a big welcoming committee with like, like when you come on a Shabbaton, when you arrive at a Shabbaton, they've always got nice juices waiting for you and snacks. You think that's how it is in Gan Eden? Like you arrive over there and they're passing around platters of sushi or samosas or something like that. That's not what's happening in Gan Eden, right? And when you arrive there, it's not that they look at you on the list and say, oh yes, you're in the penthouse suite. It's not how it works, right? So the reality of Gan Eden is that whatever pleasure is associated with the neshama's sojourn in Gan Eden is spiritual. Now the neshama arrives over there. Anybody who thinks that the minute a person is buried, they straight away switch channels and they have no connection to their life here, that's a bit far-fetched. So they arrive over there looking for the chicken livers. Right? Are they passing around? That's what you're looking for. And they say, no, sorry, what we serve over here is of a spiritual nature. Not so simple to make that transition. So as long as the body and the neshama still have a connection, the neshama is not completely free to be able to experience Gan Eden. So tikvas enosh, the wish, the hope of the neshama is that one day, Rima, I'll be rid of that body so that I can connect and experience Gan Eden. Okay? Feeling better now? Yes? But you see, words in Torah are very, very carefully chosen. Now we know that there are 4 ways in which we could describe humanity in Torah language, or the human being in Torah language, right? What names come to mind? So we've got Enosh, that's one here. Adam, right? Adam, what else? What did you say? Ish. Because we've got Adam, we've got Ish, we've got Enosh. Any others? Gever. Okay? So I know that they all sound like they're gender-specific names, but the reality is that they're names that we use to describe people at various states of spiritual development. So which out of the 4 do you think represents the most developed person? Okay, you say Gever, you say Adam. Okay, let's make this Jewish, at least a third opinion. So the correct answer to that would be Adam. Why Adam? Because there's a pasuk in Yeshaya, and the Gemara brings this with regards to how we know who qualifies as a shaliach that could represent you to do a mitzvah. The pasuk over there uses the expression Adam atem. You, the Jewish people, are called Adam. It's a special term that is reserved for the Jewish nation. So that implies that shows that somebody is very developed when they've reached the stage of Adam. That's why the first human being, which was created by Hashem's own hands, was called Adam, because that's the prototype human being. That's the ultimate human being, is called Adam. Okay, which one's the lowest of the 4? Why do you say Ish? It's a guess, right? So which is the lowest of the 4 is Enosh. Why Enosh? Because the very first person to carry the name Enosh was also the first person to introduce idolatry to the world. So that tells you somebody slipped all the way down from Adam, which has this acute awareness of Hashem, all the way down to the possibility of rejection of Hashem. That's called Enosh. So Adam is the greatest, Enosh is the lowest, Ish is on the way to becoming an Adam, and Geber has just started to lehit gaber, just started to overcome the nature of being an Enosh. Okay? So what does Rabbi Levitas tell us over here? Tikvas Enosh Rima. The person who is an Enosh, the person who's never really progressed spiritually, all they can hope for in life is Rima. That whatever they've lived for and invested in, all of that's going to disappear. So he's telling us, again, in the beginning he addresses the individual, and then he speaks in the third person. He addresses the individual and says, you, havei shefal ruach, be somebody of an exceedingly low spirit. Because Enosh, if you're going to stay an Enosh, and one of the reasons a person would stay an Enosh would be because they are arrogant, and therefore, what's the nature of arrogance? I don't feel like I have to change. I don't feel like I have to improve. So you'll be stuck as an Enosh, and all that an Enosh could become is Rima, would decompose. So because any of us is at risk of possibly becoming an Enosh or remaining an Enosh, and therefore, tikva, the only thing we could hope for is that all of that will, please God, one day disappear. That's why we have to be shefal ruach, a moed shefal ruach. But that's us. Somebody of the caliber of Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't have that problem. So by him, it only says moed once, because he doesn't have to be urged with the same kind of urgency as us that lest you remain an Enosh. Moshe was an Adam, right? Right throughout, even when he's described as Anav, he's described as Ha'ish Moshe, which is a higher state of the human being. Now, it's really important that we understand, before we go any further, this concept of humility, because I think it's a concept which challenges us very badly. For example, remember, we have Jewish guilt. That's already one problem. Then we have this issue of humility that is always drummed into us. You have to be really humble. So now what do you do if somebody gives you a compliment? You say thank you, right? Now that would be the healthy response. And halavai, more people would actually have that response. Because a lot of the time what happens is, oh no, you know. That's what we do, right? It was nothing, you know. I slept in the middle of the night 25 minutes down the road into some dark alley to help you change your tire. No, it was nothing. I was going anyway. Right? So correct. So humility is so somebody comes over to you and says, you know, you're a really good person. And we don't know what to do with this information because, you know, you're humble. If you say I'm guilty, if you tell me I'm good and I accept it, maybe it will go to my head. And then I'll become arrogant. Right? So we walk this weird tightrope of trying to work out how should we handle, you know, our own value.
But if you say thank you, Baruch Hashem.
Oh, so there you go. Right? Just say exactly. Now that's a fantastic response. Thank you, Baruch Hashem. In other words, me, I didn't do this. And that's why Moshe is considered the icon of humility, and that's where we can learn from. So what's the story with Moshe? It says, that Moshe was humble in the face of every other person on earth. Now, why don't you just say he was the most humble person? What does it mean on the face of every other person on earth? So listen to what it says. The Chazal tell us that what happened with Moshe was that he would always think to himself, what if somebody else had been given the same gifts that I was given? Perhaps that person would have used them better than I'm using them. So it's not just simply Baruch Hashem, thank God. Listen, the reality is, if I happen to be an intelligent person, if I happen to be a good-looking person, if I happen to be a nice person, it's not necessarily my doing, it's a gift that I was given. Some people are blessed with that, and some people are blessed with that. Not only Baruch Hashem, because that's one degree of humility, but the shiflus, what allows me to even, what shiflus means, to allow myself to be lower than another person, essentially. So the shiflus is to say, if somebody else had been given the gifts that I was given, because every one of us is given gifts. We have to acknowledge we don't create those gifts, we're given those gifts. If somebody else was given those gifts, perhaps they would have done a better job than me. That's a direct link to the previous Mishnah. Al tehivaz l'chol adam. Don't disdain any person. Because when you consider that the other person perhaps wasn't given the same brachos that you were given, and not only that, but if they had been given those brachos, they may have done a better job than you. You'll never be baz l'chol adam. You'll never ever look at anybody askance. And you'll naturally be ma'oid shefal ruach. You'll be extremely humble yourself. That leads directly into Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroika. He says, "Hamechalel shem shamayim baseiser." If a person desecrates Hashem's name in private, how does a person desecrate Hashem's name in private? We always think of Chilul Hashem simply, and it's correct, simply as what others will see and what conclusions they'll make from that. So, for example, the Gemara tells us, very interesting Gemara, a list of different sages and things that they did to avoid creating a Chilul Hashem. So Rav, for example, says, if I would go to a shop and buy something on credit, that would be a Chilul Hashem. Because people would imagine that perhaps I haven't paid for the item. Imagine that. Oy vey, there goes the whole 21st century. Buying something on credit could be a Chilul Hashem. Like, we don't actually see the money change hands. Rabbi Yochanan would say that if I walk more than Daled Amos, which is nothing, it's 2 meters, without wearing tefillin and reviewing words of Torah, that would be a Chilul Hashem. So what is Chilul Hashem usually? Doing something that others may see or interpret in any way as diminishing Hashem's greatness in the world. Now, what is the meaning of the word Chilul? We translated it as desecrate, right? Do we know any other word that has similar letters but a slightly different meaning? That's the kuf, right? So curse with a kuf, this is with a ches. So, halal. Oh, what is halal? Empty, void. We use it in modern terminology to refer to outer space. But halal is something which is void. What is a chilul Hashem? The real meaning of chilul Hashem, you create an absence of godliness in a space. So in the most simple terms, what is chilul Hashem? A person behaves in a bad way, so somebody else who observes it feels less Hashem in their life. I want nothing to do with those people. I want nothing to do with the philosophy that they represent. That's your classic chilul Hashem, right? You're causing Hashem now to be absent in some part of the world because of behavior. But the real notion of chilul Hashem is that even if nobody else is watching, if a person behaves in such a way that is a chilul Hashem, that creates an absence of Hashem in that space, that is exactly what he's referring to. Some of the Mefarshim want to suggest that chilul Hashem could be when two people engage in a sin together and nobody else sees. But the truth is, it goes beyond that, even one individual on their own, and this is the link between the two parts of the Mishnah. Because what is the greatest chilul Hashem that a person can perpetrate? So to embarrass somebody else is definitely a form of chilul Hashem, no question. Why would a person do that? What would lead somebody to embarrass somebody else? Go back to the first part of the Mishnah. Ma'oid avei shefal ruach. The most important thing, and we have to be extreme about it, is humility. So what's the opposite of humility? Is arrogance. What causes absence of Hashem in the world? Arrogance. There's a whole section in the Gemara Sota that speaks about arrogant people. And the Gemara says the following. It says, first of all, a person who is arrogant deserves to be chopped down like the Asherah tree. The Asherah tree was a tree that they used to worship, and you have to cut it down. And the Gemara that brings the same word is used in reference to arrogant people and in reference to the Asherah tree. Meaning what? Meaning that there's an association of idolatry with arrogance. Remember we said before there's an association with anger and arrogance. Now it's no surprise that the Rambam says these are the two traits that we have to be extreme about, because both of these traits potentially deny Hashem in the world. That creates a chalal, it creates an absence of God in the world. So then the Gemara there continues. And the Gemara says, firstly, the Gemara there says that if a person is arrogant, they don't wake up for the resurrection of the dead. Because the pasuk about the resurrection says, V'hakitzu v'rananu shoichnei afar. So most people translate that as they will wake up and they will sing those who lie in the dust. But that would be shoichvei afar. Shoichnei afar, says the Gemara, comes from the word shachein, which is a neighbor. The person who is a neighbor to the dust, meaning to say they keep themselves lowly, they're close to the earth. That's who wakes up at the time of the resurrection. Okay, so it's interesting. And then the Gemara says this. Any person who is full of themselves, Hashem says to that person, you and I cannot live in the same space. In modern words, nowadays people use the expression, this town is not big enough for the two of us. But this is where it comes from. It comes from the Gemara, right? The Gemara says Hashem turns to the person and says, if a person is arrogant, then Hashem says, I don't want to be in their space. That creates the chalal, that creates the vacuum, the void, that creates a so-called absence of Hashem, and that's the link between the two parts of the Mishnah. So it could be baseiser, could be that a person is arrogant when nobody's around. They still think of themselves as some kind of a big deal. And by the way, it's very likely that if a person battles arrogance, they will also battle anger. Because anger is usually the result of, hey, it didn't go my way. So that's what the two parts of the Mishnah are really teaching us. Ma'oid, havei shval ruach. The most important thing for us is always to invite Hashem into our lives. Like the story when Menachem Mendel of Kotsk was a little boy and somebody challenged him and said, tell me, young man, where is God? And he said, wherever you allow him in. And that's effectively what it's telling us. We have to be shefal ruach, small enough to allow Hashem to be the dominant feature in our lives, because if we don't, that is chilul Hashem. That in itself, without anybody even noticing, creates this chalal, this absence, this void of Hashem, which obviously is antithetical to whatever a Jew is supposed to be doing in life. I'm going to stop the recording.